Chuck, I'm going to kick off because I'm too cheap to pay for the to pay for
Yeah,
a subscribed Zoom
I
thing. I
agree.
think we're limited to 40 minutes or something. So I'm just going to kind of roll into a kind of an introduction about you and then just get straight into a couple of questions for you to throw your weight into, if that's all right.
Okay, I'll do my best.
So yeah, everybody listening, this is Chuck Thompson. He and I go, geez, Chuck, we got to go back like 15 years, I think, to the start of our relationship or something like that.
At this point,
Um, but Chuck is, I'm just going to indulge me, Chuck. I'm going to read a couple of lines from your about page just to give a bit of a sense of where you've been and what you've done. He's a well-known author, started off with travel writing. He's done some very hilarious books. I've read at least one of them. Smile When You're Lying was the one I read, really good. But you started off kind of doing a blend of military history and travel stuff, if that's the correct way to describe it. Your most recent books have kind of segued away from travel into more kind of political and social topics, which I'll get onto in a sec. But you've also, like I said, we go back 15 years when I was a fresh-faced copy editor landing in Hong Kong with my life in two suitcases to start a new project from CNN called CNN Go. Chuck was the editorial director, charged with the editorial direction, the content, and everything that we did. And I think at that point, it wasn't a pure travel project. There was kind of all, is a bit of a hodgepodge, trying little bits of everything. But under Chuck, it became quite a successful product from CNN, particularly in Asia, and later became CNN Travel. Chuck is also currently the editor of a non-profit environmental news website called Columbia Insight. And he has written and contributed to numerous publications, including The New Republic, Politico, Outside, Outdoor Life, Medium and Forge, Men's Journal, Atlantic Monthly, Salon, National Geographic Adventure, Esquire, Popular Mechanics, Men's Health. Chuck's is the kind of intro that if I don't catch myself, it'll take up, way too much of this conversation. So I'll leave it there. I don't think I got anything wrong there, Chuck, but I want you to kind of go back really to 15 years ago in your travel writing and travel editing days, and maybe just because, like I say, you've moved away from that a little bit to some degree these days. Is that fair to say? And how much does travel writing and travel editing play a part in your life these days?
it's definitely fair to say that I've moved away from it to some degree intentionally, but it's kind of impossible to shake. I started my first job in the travel writing business was at an in-flight magazine for American Airlines, and I have a fellow editor there, a colleague who I stayed in touch with over the years, and she's really tried to move away from travel writing and has, but she always says that the stink of in-flight magazines, you can never quite shake it once it's on your resume. And it is really funny. I think there's something perhaps so, I don't know, romantic or desirable about travel writing that even if I haven't done any travel writing for 10 years, I'll meet people or see people and they do tend to identify me that way. Um, I don't always love that, only because there is kind of a stigma around a certain type of travel writing, that of the author or writer who is taking junkets and writing pieces, veiled advertorial on behalf of a resort or an airline or something. And I have done some of that, by the way. I don't deny it. I've done quite a bit of that. But yeah, I felt like I did as much travel writing as I could possibly do, and I did my best stuff. So I'm sort of more interested in other things these days. That said, I still get called from people from time to time to do travel pieces, and I don't work. I'm not on staff at Men's Journal any longer, but I'm freelanced a travel piece for them last summer.
I mean, it is one of those really popular and therefore super competitive niches. Maybe because everyone feels they can do it. Like it's a little bit different to political writing. It's a little bit different to finance or business writing. It's kind of just people going out into the world. Do you think there's a sense of that with why everyone, and do you think people have the wrong image of this travel writer being some guy lying in a hammock on a beach in Bali, penning pensive thoughts into a journal and then whizzing them off to be published somewhere? I mean, it can be hard work, but it feels like the most accessible niche to get into, doesn't it, sometimes?
In a way, yes. when I began travel writing in the 90s, I mean, the industry and the form, the craft, whatever you want to call it, was diverging very dramatically from that type of writing that you're talking about, of a traveler going to far-flung destinations in the world and jotting down his or her experiences and thoughts and opinions on what he or she had experienced, and sharing that with other people in the world. That sort of travel writing, I think, blossomed and became very popular in England, and sort of Victorian era travelers going to Europe and going to Asia and these places, and they spread to America and other parts of the world. I think it was quite necessary at that time because people didn't have television and the internet and that sort of thing. So it was um, kind of a nice thing to have somebody go to Manila in 1920 and paint a picture for you of Manila, or Hong Kong, or New York City, whatever it was. As video and television and mass media progressed, and particularly with the internet, the travel writing changed to what is euphemistically called service journalism, which is, I don't need you, James Durston, to go tell me what it's like in Thailand, because I'm going there next week, or I probably was there 2 years ago. What I need is information on how to book my flight, where's the cheapest flight, where's the four-star hotel that I can get a discount on. This is the service part, right? And so when I started doing travel writing, I came into it, like a lot of people, thinking I might be, Paul Theroux, or Paul Theroux. I'm still never quite sure how to pronounce it. I think it's Theroux, actually. I want to be on a train for 2 weeks and write all about all the funny characters that I've met on that train. That still exists, and people have carved out pretty nice livings even now doing blog posts and things like that. And I admire those people. And I did get to do some of that with magazine journalism, but a lot of the travel writing that I ended up doing ended up being kind of that service journalism stuff. And it gets really boring, 3 perfect days in Miami, and here's the best Cuban sandwich, and here's the cool beach that nobody knows about, and here's where to get an incredible milkshake with rum in it or something.
Mhm.
So I got kind of bored with it. So there are those two very different types of travel writing, I think, and most people who end up getting into the racket kind of you end up in a service journalism part pretty quick, because that's what people will pay you to do.
No,
It's hard to
exactly.
get people to pay you to just muse about the local cuisine and the
Yeah.
natives in Buenos Aires or whatever.
Well, I guess if you do it well, like you say, you could set up your own blog and find your own audience. You don't need to rely on a publisher to get those pieces out there. But you're right, and I do seem to remember, although we did a lot of different stuff at CNN, that utility stuff was a big part of what we did. We had a section at the bottom of every piece with the kind of the service info, I think we called it, wasn't it? That if you might have just written a lovely purple piece about bathhouses in Turkey or something, but then you need the section at the bottom that says how to get there, how much they cost, and whatever, any secret passwords to get in and that sort of stuff. Is that a shame, do you think? I mean, because that is, the internet is a tool essentially, and people on the internet are looking for information to help them with these travels now because they can get there so easily and cheaply. So I
I
feel
think,
like it's necessary, but you just didn't want to do it yourself. Is that kind
yeah,
of
I think it's only a shame if you're a writer who has ambitions to, share your opinions or write flowery elocutions of your experiences. I don't think it's a shame as much as I just think it's inevitable. Like I said, in the early days of travel writing, National Geographic was once one of the most, in at least in the United States, and I think around the world, one of the most influential and popular magazines of all time, because you could actually see for the first time, an incredible photograph of what the Roman Colosseum looked like if you were someone sitting in your home in country England, or Arkansas or something like that. But as I said, as we've gotten to this point with our media, that we have all of these images, we have videos, it's not difficult to. I do always hate this when they say we will take you there. You'll feel like you're in Rome at with our whatever our video.
thing?
No, that's not quite true, but you do get a pretty good sense of what things look like. We were talking earlier. You mentioned maybe in a text about voice, and at CNN Go, when we launched that, There was a big effort to distinguish ourselves a little bit from the mothership, which was CNN, and that voice of omniscience, the news presentation style of, dry, here's the facts, maybe here's some opinion and context. So we did work a lot on voice and trying to be a little bit, in our case, funny or irreverent, maybe casual fun, I say would probably be the more accurate description rather than funny, um, in a way that CNN wasn't always, and that did work pretty well. It was a dance for certain because we still were a CNN branded product. We still did need to have that excellence in journalism and fact checking and precision. At the same time, we were trying to distance ourselves a little bit from that to appeal to a different audience. And that was by choice. CNN had group, a business development group within the company that was trying to expand the frontiers of its readership, particularly in Asia. And so we did that. It wasn't always successful. Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. And it wasn't always appreciated within the company. That's one thing for certain when you're playing with voice and you're trying to establish your own voice, whether that is a voice of irreverence or high culture or profanity or whatever it is that you're going for. Whenever you go outside the norm, you have to expect to be beaten back a little bit, if not quite a bit, violently so sometimes and publicly.
Mm.
Just primates after all, and nobody likes to see anybody stepping out of line. So when you're going to try to do something like that, one of the things I've learned is to absolutely just accept and that you're going to be highly criticized.
Yeah.
Even if it's good.
And I mean, voice, I mean, for me, that was a huge part of my experience of CNN Go, to be honest. And I don't know, maybe this was just me as a writer, kind of finally feeling like, wow, I can actually say stuff and write stuff here that I haven't felt able to say previously. I think travel kind of gives you that scope. There's all sorts of things you can write about and all sorts of opinions you can express. Um, and maybe you had a different view of this being from the kind of the managerial echelons of the company, but I felt like it was a huge part of CNN Go's success. I felt like particularly as we encouraged, as we got into the social media side of things, and you could see the responses from readers and that sort of thing. It really did not only set us apart from CNN, but set us apart from so many other travel publications as well. And it's something that you don't often see mentioned too much, like voice in a set of guidelines or editor feedback. It might be like in the top 5 or top 10 things that are mentioned, but sometimes it's not mentioned at all. So for those that maybe haven't come across this before, what is voice? How would you define voice, either as a publication or as a writer or as an editor, if you're looking for something like that?
You're talking about CNN Go, and that was quite intentional. That was the reason that they hired me. Actually, I'd written that book, Smile When You're Lying, which had a very intentional voice of irreverence and humor. And I am going to write in a way that the travel industry doesn't tend to like to be written about. And the way I put it, the shorthand instruction at CNN Go was, imagine you've gone on a trip and you have gone to Paris for the first time in your life. Now imagine the letter or email that you write home to your grandparents or parents about your trip. And now imagine the email or letter that you write home to your friends, your cohorts about your trip. You're going to write 2 very different emails to your grandparents. Well, we went to the Louvre and I saw they stood in a long line, but the Mona Lisa was worth it. And we had this lovely dinner, in the such and such place. Well, your friends, oh my God, James went out and we left the club at 1 and James was still there with some girl that he'd somehow connected with. And we didn't see him for the next day. And he was so hungover, he stumbled into the hotel with his eyes blurry. And clearly we're not going to get into, really graphic stuff, but that is sort of more the tone that we were after at CNN Go. And that is typically the tone that I have for myself try to adopt with my own voice. When I'm writing something, if I read it and it looks like it's something that's palatable for my parents or grandparents, I think it's pretty dull probably. And so I try to write as though I'm writing to my friends. Obviously, you have to clean that up a little bit, with profanity or graphic scenes of this or that. But it's a cleaned up version. We also used the comparison of it was pub talk, right? It's the voice. It's your pub voice. If you're at your kitchen table at your family reunion, you're going to talk in a different way than if you're on your second or third beer with your pals at the pub, relating whatever it is, whether it's a trip or your complaint about something that happened at the office or a football game that bet on, whatever. That's the voice, a cleaned up version of the voice. So that's the one that we brought to CNN Go, and that's the one that I have tended to use in my own life. And the reason I think that works really well is that, James, your voice and my voice when we're talking to our friends, it's maybe similar in tone, but it's still you. It's still you. So your pub voice is on kind of in the same realm as mine, but it's still yours. You can find your own personal way of expressing yourself that way. And I think that's why that works really well. It's all of a type, but it still allows for an individual's voice to come through.
And this goes beyond just irreverence and being subversive and all of that stuff. Like you say, being polite and well-mannered can also be a voice of sorts if your audience is that kind of person as well, if that personality type is who you're aiming to connect with. So voice here is it's almost like there's no such thing as a bad voice. There's only no voice and voice in a way, isn't there? And are you showing a bit of personality in your writing? Is the publication showing a bit of personality? Does it have kind of a demographic in mind? Can you sense that when you're reading their stories and that sort of thing?
Yeah, and then there's even the absence of voice is okay in certain situations. It's the classic, at least for American journalism students, the Associated Press, news pyramid. Here is the who, what, when, where, why. I don't need to know who you are. I just want to know what the facts were at the election headquarters in Phoenix. They counted this many votes, and these were right. That's it. I don't need any of your background. But for something like travel writing, as you said, people get into it because there is some expression of themselves and their experiences they want to convey, or they feel compelled to write about it. It's just more interesting. It's funny. I've been an editor a lot of places, and I used to notice, not so much anymore, but when I worked at that In-Flight, and then I worked at Maxim magazine and a couple other magazines in the 90s and 2000s, about one out of every 20 or 30 pitches or queries you get in were written in this humorous tone that you could tell somebody had been reading P.G. Wodehouse for a long time, right? And that's his voice is, well, one, it's of a completely different era, bygone era, but it's funny, but it's of this very mannered British upper class observer, sort of this kind of twit with a weird intelligence behind him. And, people are really taken with that voice. And I remember I wrote a story. I was assigned really early on, I wrote a story about the new age of cocktails. Oh, this was in the mid 90s, I guess, when, one of my favorite sayings, every generation believes they've discovered sex in the martini. So about every 10 or 15 years, you get this new wave of people, and they're writing about craft cocktails and martinis and old fashions and these drinks that are new somehow. I turned it in, and the editor wrote back, said, "This doesn't sound like you, and it doesn't sound like," he goes, "It's really well written, but it doesn't sound like you, and it doesn't sound like us." And I know exactly what I'd written, this sort of Wodehousian, ode to gin and tonics and bitters, this and that. And but I think it is part of the process. A lot of people, the first thing we do as writers is we've read a lot. We absorb the writers that we love. We want to write like them somehow, or even if it's not a conscious decision to emulate someone else's success, we just do it anyway because, like, oh yeah, that's great writing. I loved Right Ho Jeeves, or I loved, that was like I Pelt in the World's Most Dangerous Places. That was a huge book in the 90s when it came out. So you might have adopted that. So at some point along the way, you just kind of, it's like trying on a lot of different jackets and shirts and pants, and finally you find the ones that seem to suit you.
Is there a difference between voice and style, do you think, or are they kind of fairly compatible? I mean, would it be fair to say, Hemingway had a voice, Stephen King had a voice? I mean, I know that if I pick up a Stephen King book, I can read the first line and I kind of feel like that's a Stephen King book immediately. He's got something in the way he writes that is very much his. Is that different to what we're talking about
I
now?
suppose there's some overlap. There is that academic definition of style, which is the way that a publication will write its numerals, for example. You use the numerals 1 through 9, or you spell out 1 through 9 and then this, or you write an address in a certain way, or you abbreviate the name of a state or a province in a certain way. There's that version of style. And that's when you say style, that's what I always think of. The Chicago Manual of Style is a pretty typical style for book editors in the US. The AP Style Associated Press style book is pretty good for that. However, there is this other, I know what you're saying when you say style and voice and that overlap. I think there's some overlap to it, but I think of style as more the strunk and white elements of style and this sort of rigid guidelines of how we're going to arrange information or present information. And I think of voice as the personality behind
And voice can sometimes, I mean, I won't name the guy, but it can sometimes kind of, at the very least, make you memorable, if not kind of almost back. I don't know if you remember one of these, a British writer we had at CNN Go who would write in these funny fonts and would have all these crazy ideas. And
it. Was he the flaneur? Was he the self-styled flaneur? Remember
no,
that?
no, no, that was somebody else. No, no, no. This was a British guy who had written for, again, kind of a very old school. I won't. I think I've got his name in my head. I don't want to name him just in case there's
Yeah,
laws
right.
flying around later on. But he would
I
write
do remember him. I do remember him.
bizarre pitches in a funny font, and it was like his pitches were very much in his voice, but his voice was so extreme and so out there and so different. You were a little bit kind of tentative about actually assigning stuff to him. I mean, he
Well,
did do a few pieces for me, and they were pretty good, but they did require quite a bit of editing as well, just to bring it down a little.
another shorthand, easy way to define voice for people is forget the word voice, just call it personality. That's maybe perhaps easier for people to say, I don't, just give me your personality on the page. That's pretty easy to figure out. What kind of person are you? How do you talk? You gloomy and morose and complaining, Seinfeld, George Costanza, person who's never happy and always finding the problem with something, the world's against you, or are you more, optimist, go lucky? Another thing, though, about voice that I think a lot of people should be aware of if they're writing for whatever, Condé Nast Traveler or CNN or an obscure website from Spain or something, is that someone told me this long ago when I was pretty young and was bristling about being edited quite heavily at a magazine. They said, Chuck, look at what's at the top of the magazine. It's Maxim magazine, or it's Better Homes and Gardens, or it's Entertainment Weekly, or it's Mojo. That's why people buy this magazine. They don't buy this magazine because it says Chuck Thompson on your byline. Nobody's reading your byline. So your voice here has to conform with our style, with our standards. If you're writing a book, or your own blog, that's your name on it at the top. Nobody buys a book because it's published by Random House or Henry Holt and Sons or whatever. They don't care. They're looking at your name. So that's a very different kind of thing. And I do find when I know that somebody is inexperienced or has just not done much writing or isn't a professional in my sense of the word, it's when they're writing for a publication that's been around for a while and they complain about the edits pretty hard. Now, there's always some back and forth with writers and editors. I'm not saying every complaint or could you change this? I'd feel better about this. That's different. But when a writer truly bristles or becomes unhappy because they're being edited to write in the style of People magazine, or I'm using all these American references, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's one thing it was a really good lesson for me. The editors at the magazine are the voice of the magazine. Now, if you're going to be a successful writer, you'll learn how very quickly to adapt to that style. And I'm bringing this back to your anecdote about the British writer who was really trying to bring his own style, his own personality, his own eccentricities and odd ways of expressing himself. That's not going to work in the long run. If you continue to try to bring your personality to a product, they might say, hey, funny writing, good stuff, John, but not for us. It's not really for us.
Mm. I mean, that brings the idea in that especially for someone like you, say, who have been writing for a long time, and you're kind of well known as being very voicey. You know, you're quite irreverent, you're quite controversial, or at least provocative in many ways. One of your entire books was about the secession of the North and the South in America, right? That was probably your most provocative book I think you've done so far.
For sure.
But the topic itself can almost be full of voice, can't it? Just how you decide the stuff you decide to write about. But are you now still very conscious of your own voice as you write? You know, the way, especially if you're writing for other magazines or a new magazine, is it something you're always kind of self-editing as you go, or is it a much more kind of natural process these days?
It depends. If it's a publication that I haven't written for very often, I definitely one of the first things I do is I look at as much of the, I spend an hour or two reading that content to get a sense of the type of thing that they want. And, there's this term hack journalism. Well, hack has taken on its own life, but it's become kind of a pejorative term for writers. But I find it a compliment. The original version of hack was a writer who could come in and write competently and skillfully about any number of topics quickly. You could learn about finance or fashion or whatever it is you needed to write about. And so I feel I'm pretty competent at being able to do that. If somebody from a cooking website, called me up to do a thing, I'd look at their website and I could write in that sort of vernacular that they use. At the same time, I'm kind of in a weird place. The one thing you said that I would maybe disagree with, you said that I get everything right on your bio. I didn't write that I was a well-known author on my own about.
I may have introduced that little element. Yeah, that was my edit.
And, thank you. That was nice of you. But I don't necessarily assume that anyone knows who I am. But occasionally, because I have done some books and other things, I will get a call from somebody that wants me to write in that voice. They want me to be Chuck Thompson for their publication. And that's very easy for me to do. That's a nice assignment for me. I can do that all day long. On the other hand, about a month or two ago, maybe a couple of months now, there's a quite famous American baseball star named Pete Rose, who led a controversial life. He'd gambled on baseball. He'd been expelled from the game. He was one of the greatest hitters of all time. Do you happen to know who Pete Rose is by any chance?
I'm not heard of him, I'm afraid, no.
Probably one of the top 5 or 10 most famous American baseball players of the last 50 years. Anyway, he died about 2 months ago. And there's an outfit out of New York that I've been doing some work for that generates these one-off publications. They're called SIP, special interest publication. If a celebrity dies, they'll crank out a really quick 100-page, 120-page magazine. The Life and Times of Pete Rose, the Pete Rose you never knew. Willie, I don't want to say if anybody dies. I was going to say there's some older celebrities that you know these types of magazines, right?
Yeah.
This editor at the place happened to know that I was a big baseball fan and have been for my whole life. So he called me and said, can you write 100 pages on Pete Rose in a week? And I said, okay, I'll do it. To that project, I didn't bring any of my Chuck Thompson voice. I did a lot of research very quickly and wrote competent copy, just describing this man's life from childhood until death and all of the peaks and valleys that he went through. So in that case, people don't need my voice. They don't want it. And I don't bother with it.
And is there a difference between voice and opinion? I mean, I feel like, one of the things that you created at CNN Go were these tell me about it columns, which were very heavy on opinion. That the whole idea was to inject kind of either a provocative or a contrarian or just an interesting opinion about some topic. I really loved them. Not everybody did. Some people get a bit intimidated by putting that kind of stuff out there, but they really encapsulated, I feel, the voice of CNN Go, that willingness to put something out there and let others judge or agree or disagree, basically, to start a conversation rather than to end one.
I'm really happy that you remember those and like those because I liked them too. And one of the things I feel once you're in a digital media, you hear about engagement all the time. You want to engage your audience. And I felt that one of the best ways to engage an audience is with an opinion, particularly a strong opinion. And that was the genesis of that idea. The other thing is that you don't see a lot of opinion pieces in travel magazines. At least I never had in the magazines I'd worked for in the 90s and 2000s. There wasn't an op-ed sort of section. I recall your famous one was like why I hate museums, right? Or I don't want to go to museums on vacation. Maybe that's a nice
Yeah.
way to put it. Great piece. Got a ton of reaction. You ended up doing, didn't somebody invite you to go speak somewhere?
Yeah, they did. I couldn't
You
go,
still
but
have
yeah,
that on
I
your
mean, that
website?
was,
Is that still online? Can I find that?
I think you can probably, yeah, why I hate museums, which,
That was great.
instantly, instant bombardment of you're a travel editor and you hate museums, what's going on? But it did exactly what it was meant to do, which was to get engagement, get reaction. It spawned a whole load of other blog posts on other people's blogs, which was exactly, I presume, the idea behind that whole column was to
It
generate
was. But
discussion.
you did that really well because, yes, the idea behind those things was to be a provocateur of sorts, but you backed it up. It wasn't just this
Hmm,
audacious, outrageous claim to be an asshole for the sake of being an asshole.
sure.
You had a quite well reasoned argument for not wasting
Well,
time on
Well,
vacation.
we're gonna run out of time in about 30 seconds, I think. So thank you very much.
Okay.
Anything else? Any last 10-second nugget you want to leave about voice?
Not really. It's always fun to talk about this stuff with people who care about it. I appreciate what you're doing, James.
Yeah.
It's a fun conversation.
Well, like I say, it's such a huge part of my work with you and with CNN, and I think the success of that platform, it's an important thing for people to at least think about anyway. So